Good morning. I'm Genevieve Robson. I'm the Director of Medical Communications at Touch Medical Media. Touch is a publisher of independent, peer-reviewed medical review journals, including the titles US Endocrinology and European Endocrinology. We have some copies of the journals here for you if you'd like to pick one up. This morning we're going to discuss reviews on the research on sugar, diabetes, obesity, and the importance of physical activity. These reviews were published or will be published in the journals I just mentioned. And today we're going to explore the science behind some of the statements that have been made in this debate so far. We've provided reprints of all of the relevant articles in your press packs. I'd like to acknowledge the Coca-Cola Company, who have provided an unrestricted educational grant to support this activity. They've supported the publication of the articles and also this activity here today. The grant is unrestricted, which means that the opinions of the doctors that you'll hear today are entirely their own. I'll now turn the podium over to Dr. Steve Blair, who's going to moderate the discussion. Dr. Blair.
Thank you, Genevieve, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for coming to this discussion of some very important public health issues, obesity, diabetes, physical activity, diet, and so forth. You are quite fortunate, we're all fortunate to have four outstanding internationally famous scientists who have conducted and are still conducting really seminal research in these various areas. Their brief bios are in your press packets, and I know them all very well. I could, where I've worked with some of them for decades and continue to work, so I could give you a long list of things, maybe including a couple of interesting stories on one or two of them, but I won't do that. Just turn to their bio, and I will keep my introduction brief. We're asking each of them to speak for about 10 minutes, and when all have finished, then we will open the floor to questions and discussion. So our first speaker is Dr. John Sievenpiper, St. Michael's Hospital and University of Toronto. John?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really delighted to be here today to share with you some of the research that we've put into this review on this important topic. And I think that this is an important topic to start out with because it just is so topical at the moment. This is a debate that just really, in its sort of second iteration, just started 10 years ago, that has really been full of emotion and politics. And I think it really requires an evidence-based framework. So I hope we can sort of struggle through some of the data. It's really been high on commentary and opinion, and low on data. So I think, you know, we have different backgrounds and different levels of knowledge, but I'm hoping that I can impress you with some of the data, and maybe you can leave with maybe a more informed view on this. The other thing I want to emphasize in this, I think it's really important as I go through this, that we have to put this in the context of the whole diet. I think we have to be careful. We have lots of examples in recent history where we've wanted to vilify specific nutrients, and I think it's just given way to another nutrient to vilify and so on. And I think we actually have to stop that and look at the whole diet. And we also have to look at the physical activity or the energy state, if you like, of the individual and how this debate relates to that. So with that introduction, let's get started. So the current iteration of this debate, and I say current iteration because I think we have to have a sense of history. There was actually a very, very vigorous debate in the 1970s between the two great, it was a fat sugar debate between its two great champions, Ansel Keys with the 7-country study and John Yudkin with his Pure, White, and Deadly. Coming out of that debate, we know that the fat hypothesis dominated and it really shaped low-fat dietary advice going forward. If we now fast forward to 2004, so some 30 years later, this seminal paper really kicked off the current debate and put the attention squarely back on sugar. So this paper was by George Bray and Barry Popkin. George Bray is a very famous researcher in the area of obesity. And what he simply did here, and I mean, I have to be, in fairness to George, I think he called it what it was. This is just an ecological analysis. It's just correlating two things in time. What he showed, do we have the pointer here? It is. My apologies. What he showed was that with the introduction of high fructose corn syrup in the early 1970s, there was an increase in total fructose and high fructose corn syrup, obviously free fructose, and that this increase paralleled the increase in overweight and obesity. Now, this is an ecological analysis. It's generally considered a very weak level of evidence. We don't use it to inform public policy or clinical practice guidelines. And the reason is it's just two variables being correlated. It does not adjust for any confounding variables. So, for example, over the same time, energy consumption also went up. Physical activity levels went down. Sedentary behaviors went up. Computer FaceTime. We were more at car centers. So there's a lot of things. And ecological studies have given way to the term ecological fallacy. And so to give you an example, over the same period, we have bottled water going up and asparagus going up. Now, these aren't biologically plausible drivers of obesity and diabetes, but I think we still have to be careful about ascribing too much biological plausibility to want to believe these patterns that we're seeing. So despite those limitations, this really kicked off this sort of second iteration of the debate, if you like, version 2.0, really kicked off a landslide of interest in this area. And it's been driven really by commentaries and letters and strong opinions. Again, high in opinion, low on data. And we have examples from the lay media, and I'm not going to go through all of these. It's just to give you some examples from my Canadian media, the Globe and Mail, New York Times. We have some blogs here. We have Mark Bittman. We have a BMJ blog, as well as a very vigorous debate in the literature in terms of commentaries and letters and editorials. And this has culminated really in celebrity status for one of the biggest, or most enthusiastic, if you like, champions of this debate, which would be Robert Lustig. So Rob Lustig, his YouTube video, and I just downloaded this 2 nights ago, is now just teetering on 4 million hits, which is quite impressive for a 90-minute academic video. As an academic, I would love to be able to translate my science in such a powerful way that I could give a 90-minute dry academic video and that would be viewed by 4 million people. But I mean, so he, in a way, is a great example, I think, that as scientists and academics, we need to look and see how he's got his message out. And this has culminated in him being invited to submit and publish a commentary in Nature. Now, Nature is sort of the pinnacle of scientific publishing, if you will. So if it's in Nature, it must be true. This is sort of the dogma, if you like. So this is the background on which the story launches. So what are the charges against fructose and fructose-containing sugars? Well, if we use the table from Professor Lustig's Nature article, he likes to compare chronic fructose exposure to chronic ethanol exposure. So whereas chronic ethanol exposure is good for these 12 different maladies, if you like, a lot of them what I would call cardiometabolic, so involving cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, chronic fructose exposure is good for 8 of those, in particular hypertension, myocardial infarction or heart attack as it relates to blood lipid levels being abnormal or insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, pancreatitis, obesity, and the corollary of alcoholic fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver. So we and others, we've criticized this evidence because it's really driven a lot by animal studies, select human studies which provide overfeeding, and what we would say poor quality observational studies. What I think we need to do in this debate is we need to really invoke an evidence-based framework, and we need to use the same evidence that we would use to inform clinical practice guidelines and public health policies. That really puts the emphasis on randomized trials at the top, which decrease or mitigate bias the most and allow us to isolate the effects that we're actually looking at, so we can be sure that when we see something, it's actually because of how we randomize the patients as opposed to other confounding factors. And below that, very well-controlled observational studies. And what we do in terms of analytical tools is we pool all of these together using systematic reviews and meta-analyses to really get an objective answer. It's not pooled based on what I think is important. It's pooled based on the totality of the evidence, and the weighting is done by the quality of the studies. So in this, if we invoke this, what do we find? Well, let's take a look at cohort studies, which are probably our best designed observational studies. So we've done a series, my students have meta-analyzed a series of topics looking at fructose as it relates to diabetes, hypertension, gout, overweight, obesity, and CHD. And what I can tell you is if we look across these, is we don't see any link with total sugar intake. So if we look at total sugar or total fructose-containing sugars, we don't see the relationship with these diseases, the only exception being for gout. And if I give you one example, because we're here to talk about diabetes, we did this systematic review meta-analysis here. We pooled 7 cohorts in over 150,000 people. And what you can see here, this is the summary estimate. I'm not going to give you a crash course in statistics, but these are the point estimates from the studies. This is the summary estimate, the diamond. That's what I would ask you to look at. And what you can see is that it crosses this middle line, which means that it's not showing either harm or benefit. It's showing no association. Now, where there is an association, which really has got a lot of attention, is sugar-sweetened beverages. But I think we have to ask the question, is there something special about sugar-sweetened beverages? How are sugar-sweetened beverages contributing more to obesity than other factors in the diet? And if we look at observational studies again, and we look at the best designed ones, and we pool them, what we find is that maybe sugar-sweetened beverages certainly play a role, but they don't play the dominant role. If we look here, sugar-sweetened beverages more than, for example, confectionery or other sugar-sweetened foods. If we look here compared to, let's say, for example, French fries, this is weight gain every 4 years with an increase in 1 serving. So if you increase 1 serving, every 4 years you get about 1 pound from sugar-sweetened beverages. You get over 3 pounds from French fries, over 1.5 pounds from potato chips or crisps. Processed meat and red meat each contribute approximately 1 pound. Potato products, fried foods, and trans fat. So I think we have to be careful wanting to ascribe too much to any one component. What I'd ask you to do is to consider the whole diet. I think sugars do play a role, but I think only insofar as they really contribute to a Western dietary pattern. And I think that that's an important point, because are sugar-sweetened beverages, or added sugars if you like, a marker of an unhealthy lifestyle? Because what we know is, for example, people that drink, high consumers of sugar-sweetened beverages exercise less, they smoke more, and they consume more energy. And they also tend to have a Western dietary pattern. And if we take advantage of all of that we call collinearity, and we actually do a dietary pattern analysis, when we look at a Western dietary pattern, we can explain far more of the obesity and far more diabetes risk. So that's the cohort studies, the well-designed observational studies. So our conclusions from those really are that prospective cohort studies, which is our best designed observational studies, have failed to show a significant positive association between total fructose-containing sugars and incident obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Total fructose-containing sugars from sugar-sweetened beverages are an exception. We do see a signal. The associations with sugar-sweetened beverages, though, are only significant extreme intakes. The effect sizes are quite small. They tend to be collinear or have this sort of, if you like, clustering with other risk factors in the diet. So we have to really interpret them as a whole. And if we look at the whole diet and we can look at dietary patterns, a Western dietary pattern explains far more. So now to change gears, let's look at the best designed studies we have from trials. And we have two types of trials. We have substitution trials, and I think that's important because we don't consume things in a vacuum. If we take something away, we tend to replace it with something. So we want to do sugars, or in this case fructose. Does it behave differently than other forms of carbohydrate with which we might replace it? So these would be holding energy equal. And addition trials where we actually add the sugar on top, or in this case the fructose on top of the diet, providing excess energy. So in this case, we have a couple things happening. You're adding the sugar, you have the energy and the interaction between the two. So what do these different types of studies show us? Well, we've conducted a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses which we've published. There's 7 here. And what we found, I can tell you across all of these, is that if you match for energy, if you just exchange the fructose for another form of carbohydrate, what we find is sugar, or in this case the fructose, is no worse than any other form of carbohydrate. I think that's important. That's not to say that starch, with which it's compared, or glucose, or banana. I don't think we should be necessarily mean that we should consume more of those. But I think it's important to know that if you do that exchange and you match for energy, you don't see the effect. And if we look at the studies, and again, not to give you a statistical crash course, all you need to do is look at these points. This represents the totality of the evidence, more than 50 trials and more than 1,000 participants across different endpoints. In this case, I would say let's take a look at body weight, let's take a look at blood sugar control. What you can see is that fructose behaves no differently, or it's not any worse, I would say, than other forms of carbohydrate. And if anything, we may see benefit in terms of blood pressure and glycemic control, where calorie is not a calorie, but certainly no evidence of harm. But what about if we add the sugar on top? Well, then I think a lot of the things that Professor Lustig has mentioned, they do come to life. So what you see here is where fructose is providing excess energy. And I think this is completely predicted by the excess energy. And you would say, of course, they're going to gain weight because they're consuming more calories. Of course, their blood lipids are going to look worse. They're going to get fatty liver, and they're going to get higher uric acid levels. So when it provides excess calories, we absolutely see it. So I think the energy status of the individual is very important in this particular debate. So what are our overall conclusions? First of all, like I think with the earlier fat story, and I think we have to be very careful not to make the same mistakes. We have to look at our history that we've done for fat, and now we're doing for salt, and now for sugar. It is difficult to separate the contribution of fructose-containing sugars from that of other factors in the epidemic of obesity and diabetes, owing to the small effect sizes, lack of demonstrated harm over other sources of excess energy in the diet. Dietary patterns, again, a Western dietary pattern in which sugar-sweetened beverages and added sugars tend to be part of, I think provide the greatest influence from a dietary perspective, because we can't forget physical activity, on weight gain and cardiometabolic risk and diabetes, if you like. And I think we need to be talking about the whole diet and where added sugars fit into the whole diet and how that might contribute to obesity and diabetes. And I think attention then needs to remain focused on reducing overconsumption of all caloric foods, including sugary beverages and foods, especially as they contribute excess energy, and promoting greater physical activity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I didn't mention this at the outset, but we will take all questions at the end, so we'll go through each of the speakers. presentations. And our next speaker is Dr. John Forett, who's been a good friend and colleague for decades. He's at the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and we have a worldwide competition who goes to Les Mis the most. So,
that's right. Thank you, Steve. And John, that was excellent, but I guess you didn't get the message. It's red tie day, so sorry. Yeah, you didn't get the memo. My message this morning is, 2/3 of us are overweight or obese, so we need all the help we can get. And one practical solution, or at least help, would be low-calorie sweeteners, because low-calorie sweeteners offer a very inexpensive, safe, practical intervention for reducing calories. There you are. So that may help lower weight. It may help manage diabetes. So let's take a look at that. There are more than 350 million people in the world with diabetes, primarily type 2. So 350 million. So it's more than doubled. Prevalence has doubled in the last 30 years. It keeps going up, up, up all over the world, not just here, but all over the place. That's been predicted by 2030. We're going to have more than 500 million people. And think of the expense and it's a horrible disease. So we need good strategies to prevent and certainly to manage. There are many drivers to diabetes. I mean, there are many causes, multifactorial, but certainly one of them, as we get heavier and heavier, is a major association. So the association with BMI, and Nurses' Health Trial, for example, says that women will start increasing the prevalence of increasing risk for diabetes with a BMI of 22 already, which is that normal. Normal range is 18.5 to 25. So at 22, and I just pulled this up with Jim's help, 5'4" woman, 5'4", who weighs 129 pounds, 5'4", 129, is a BMI of 22. Joanne Manson's Nurses' Health Trial, showing that's already increasing risk. The Boston study with physicians and healthcare professionals, showing a man 5'10", 160 pounds, 5'10", 160 pounds, is a BMI of 23. That's already risk for diabetes. So, I mean, that's scary. So what can we do about this business? Well, small changes in diet, small changes in physical activity can help reduce weight, and there are plenty of studies to show that. So we can go through all of them if you want to, but I'll just give you an example or two. The Diabetes Prevention Program showed a 58% reduction in the incidence of new cases of type 2 diabetes with lifestyle intervention versus placebo. And what they did was, those of you, I think most of you probably know the Diabetes Prevention Program, but they recruited and randomized more than 3,200 people who were at risk for diabetes in this country. They didn't have diabetes, but they had at risk for it. Then they randomized them into 3 groups. One group got a placebo pill, all double-blind. Another group got metformin, which is one of those first-line treatment interventions for diabetes. And one group just got lifestyle, diet and exercise, with behavior modification. And that diet and exercise, the intensive lifestyle group, the goal was a 7% loss of weight, 15, 16 pounds, so a 7% weight loss, and walking 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. So 150 minutes of exercise, primarily walking, and lowering the weight by cutting calories for just 7%. I mean, people can lose 7%. Anyway, the results showed that there was a dramatic decrease, a minus 58% decrease in the incidence of new cases of type 2 diabetes with just lifestyle compared to placebo. 58%, I mean, that's just unimaginable to me. I mean, it's incredible what small changes in lifestyle can really do for people who are at risk. There was a 31% decrease comparing it to metformin, but lifestyle clearly is the winner. I mean, the way to go with this whole business is diet and exercise. And small changes, you don't have to lose 50 pounds to be healthy. You need to lose 5%. The other study I want to just review with you quickly is our study. Jim is a PI on it in Denver. I'm a PI in Houston of Look Ahead. We just published the 10-year data in the New England Journal. the end of August. So pull that up when you get a chance if you haven't seen it. But I just want to show you the relationship to diabetes. Look ahead, we recruited and randomized 5,000 plus adults with type 2 diabetes. They're also heavy, so they were overweight or obese, and also had diabetes. And when we looked at what is the effect of small changes, and the goal again is same as DPP, Diabetes Prevention Program, 7% weight loss, and then the exercise was a little bit more, 35 minutes of walking a day, 5 days a week, which is 175 minutes of walking, along with behavioral changes. And what we found with respect to diabetes, all of these people, remember, have diabetes, but what we showed over the first 4 years of the trial, which was published in JAMA, partial or complete remission of diabetes in 11.5% of patients receiving intervention. And again, this is just a weight loss study. We're interested in weight loss with respect to cardiovascular outcomes. That's our primary outcome. But when you're looking at, can you also reverse diabetes? Yeah, not in everybody, no. But I mean, it's just remarkable what small changes can do. So low-calorie sweeteners then. You want to cut 100 calories, 140 calories a day? You can do it with low-calorie sweeteners. It's common sense. They're safe, they're practical, they're inexpensive. The American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, they all conclude extensive reviews of the literature, extensive randomized controlled trials, et cetera, low-calorie sweeteners can help you reduce caloric intake and help maintaining healthy weight. I mean, that's the bottom line. There's 0 calories with diabetics. It can help control carbohydrate, obviously. They don't have any calories, or essentially negligible calories. So they're safe, they're inexpensive, they're small changes. They can serve an important role in diabetes prevention, diabetes management. It makes sense. I mean, it's just a common sense approach, and there are plenty of studies to show that when you incorporate low-calorie sweeteners into a diet, in a randomized controlled diet, you can show weight loss. They don't increase appetite. They don't increase all these things you read about on the internet. They don't increase overcompensation. They don't just go through the whole list of these things. Well, if you look at the randomized trials, they don't. They're 0 calories. They don't affect glucose because they don't have any calories. So bottom line, engaging in a healthy lifestyle is central to the prevention and management of diabetes. So one approach, again, this morning we're looking at these inexpensive practical strategies. Low-calorie sweeteners can help reduce caloric intake. It's a simple strategy to do it. Low-calorie sweeteners provide flexibility. They provide health goals. You can read the little article that we did on it, but there's plenty of others if you look at the randomized trials. Bottom line, if you want to help manage weight, both in diabetics and in all of us, low-calorie sweeteners would be one way to go. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. While I'm pulling up the next, I want to make just one additional comment. My colleagues all know I can't keep my mouth shut too long, but in the DPP, the famous study that showed the great effect of lifestyle, a lot of my clinician friends said, yeah, but it's too complicated. They have to come in and talk to dietitians and exercise counselors and so on, and it costs so much. And then DPP published the cost-effectiveness analysis. So the metformin cost twice as much and was about half as effective. Lifestyle changes are good for you.
Thank you.
Now to, who's next here? Okay. I got it. Our next speaker is Dr. Carl Chip Levy, a great colleague from the Ochsner Medical Clinic in Dallas. Been working intensively with him for the last few years, and he's a great friend and colleague. So Chip, please tell us about exercise as medicine.
Thank you very much, Steve, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be discussing the importance of physical activity, exercise, and fitness in obesity and diabetes. And basically, this is comes from the article that we just published online in the September issue of US Endocrinology. Now, to start off with what causes obesity in the first place, there's really been a lot of publicity that what's causing diabetes is the sugary beverages, sugar in the diet, the fast foods, blaming it on Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Taco Bell. But really, there's tremendous evidence that the cause of obesity has been the marked decline in physical activity that has occurred during the last 5 decades. We just published this paper in PLOS One, and many of you probably saw it because it got a lot of publicity in the media. And it wasn't all good publicity. I'll give you an example. One of the articles had a picture of me in the newspaper, and next to it, it said, "Women are getting fat because not doing enough housework." You can imagine how well this went over on the home front. It was on 3 times one night on Fox News. It was just on the Jay Leno monologue. So it's gotten a lot of publicity. But we looked at, over 5 decades, household management physical activity, and basically showed that there's dramatic declines over time in household management physical activity in women in the tone of about 1,800 calories per week. About 100 calories usually counts for a mile. That's about 18 miles of walking or jogging, which has declined over the last 5 decades in average household management physical activity in women. And likewise, one of my colleagues, Tim Church, who Steve Blair and I both have published a number of papers with, had this paper 2 years ago looking at occupational physical activity, and basically also showed very dramatic declines during the last 5 decades in both women. This one had both women and men, but very dramatic declines in occupational physical activity. And when they accounted for this, it almost totally explained the marked increase in the prevalence of obesity that has likewise occurred during these past 5 decades. Now, that's not to say that in the setting of markedly reducing physical activity that we need to cut the calories and cut the sugars and cut all foods that have excess calories to make up for this marked decline in physical activity. But the cause, the fundamental cause of obesity is the marked decline in physical activity. Now, how much is obesity contributing to cardiovascular risk? How much is it contributing to mortality? And this is a subject of considerable debate. This was a pretty high-profile paper that got published online in August, and actually just is in the news today as well, that suggests that 20% of mortality can be accounted for by obesity. But this other, even more high-profile paper was published by Catherine Flegel from the CDC in January in JAMA. It's a huge meta-analysis of 97 studies, 2.9 million individuals, accounting for 270,000 deaths. And they showed in this paper that relative to normal weight, that's the BMI 18.5 to 25 grade, obesity, when you put all grades, the mild, the moderate, and the severe, were associated with higher mortality. But when you just looked at grade 1 obesity, which is the BMI between 30 and 35, it was actually associated with a trend for 5% lower mortality. It was almost statistically significant. And the overweight BMI, which is the BMI between 25 and 30, actually had a statistically significant 6% lower mortality in this huge study. So based on this amount of data, it's certainly suggesting that the overweight and the mildly increased BMI is not contributing to tremendous excess in mortality. Now, this just looks at mortality. It doesn't account for other chronic diseases that can be affected and quality of life by obesity. But just from the standpoint of mortality, maybe times are changing a bit. And none of these studies accounted for fitness. And we just did this paper in Circulation, our leading cardiology research journal, chaired by the American Heart Association, trying to increase the awareness of how important fitness is as a cardiovascular risk factor. Clearly, studies show at high levels of fitness, mortality is much lower, and if you reduce your fitness, you get gradual increases in mortality rate, and almost all studies show this. But fitness can also affect even diabetes. This is a large study of 8,600 people over a decade ago, published by Steve Blair's group from the Aerobic Center longitudinal study that showed that people in the low fitness group, and they defined low fitness on a treadmill test as the bottom 20 percentile based on age and gender, and measuring fitness based on the speed and incline of the treadmill. Those who fell in the bottom 20 percentile in the low, moderate is the middle 40, and high is the upper 40. If you increase the level of fitness, there's a marked decline in the prevalence of diabetes. And across the whole spectrum of fitness, you go from the low fit to the middle and to the very high fit, you see progressive declines in the development of diabetes. And you see the biggest improvement if you take the person from the low level of fitness to just a little bit higher level of fitness. Basically, moving the person who's the couch potato into the person who's doing more regular physical activity, doing the regular physical activity guidelines, trying to get 150 minutes or so a week of moderate level physical activity. And what does obesity do to mortality and diabetes? This is a study of 2,300 men by our friend Tim Church, all diabetic, followed for 16 years, showed that men with the low 20 percentile of fitness had increased cardiovascular mortality at any BMI, whether they were normal weight, overweight, or mildly obese. They had about a 3-fold increased mortality compared to the normal weight and the higher fitness level. So fitness in diabetics dramatically affected survival. And across the whole spectrum of diabetes, if you go from the lower to the more fit, you see progressive declines in mortality risk. Now, certainly in the diabetics, weight mattered. The higher weights had a worse prognosis. The low fitness mattered. The lower fitness had a worse prognosis. But when you put the two together, you see those who were fit had a very good prognosis regardless of their weight, whereas those who are unfit had a bad prognosis, again, regardless of their weight. In 2 landmark early studies from his group, he showed that obese had higher all-cause and cardiovascular mortality than lean, but obese who were fit were no more likely to die than lean who were fit. And many other reports show the same thing. In fact, if you look at change in fitness and change in fatness over time, one big study from D.C. Lee that we co-authored on showed that once you accounted for change in fitness, change in fatness over time no longer was a significant predictor of survival. And the biggest thing is getting people, again, from this low level of fitness just into the next level of fitness. So we'd like to get everybody into very high levels of fitness, but the biggest bang for the buck is moving the person who's unfit to just the next level of fitness, and one can do that with just increasing physical activity. Now, most of what we're talking about is cardiorespiratory fitness, but muscular strength matters too, and muscular strength, particularly with resistance training, improves some parameters that improve glucose control. And there have been studies certainly showing that muscular strength is a predictor of cardiovascular risk factors and cardiovascular survival. So in conclusion, exercise as medicine makes some pretty important points. Physical and fitness is an important component of health and overall health-related quality of life. Cardiorespiratory fitness may, in fact, be our strongest cardiovascular risk factor. Although in a perfect world, being lean and fit may be ideal, but in the fit versus fat debate, fitness seems to be considerably more important than fatness. And certainly exercise as medicine emphasizes that greater efforts are needed to assess and improve physical activity, exercise, and fitness. The current guidelines are that all individuals should be doing 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week or 75 minutes of vigorous physical activity. The Institute of Medicine says all individuals should be doing about 60 minutes each day of physical activity. Well less than 30% of our society are even coming close to meeting these goals. So we have plenty of room that we can make improvements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chip, for an excellent presentation. And let me get the final one pulled up here. As you can tell from the schedule, our next speaker is Professor Jim Hill. Again, another great colleague going back decades. I'm not going to tell him the spillage story, Jim, so you can relax about that. And he's at the University of Colorado. He's going to talk about energy balance. Jim?
Thank you, Steve, and it's a pleasure to be here. See a lot of old friends in the audience. I have 10 minutes to tell you why you should be concerned about energy balance. Okay? So here's a schematic of the energy balance system. I'm not here to convince you that energy balance is how the body regulates weight. If you don't believe that, we'll talk about gravity and whether you believe in that or not. I'm here to tell you that in understanding energy balance, we're going to understand potentially ways that we can more effectively address obesity. So I show this cartoon about energy balance. It looks pretty simple: energy intake, energy expenditure, body stores. You can actually make it much more complex. I can show you in the brain all this regulatory systems. The science these days is beautifully describing how this system is regulated. Okay, there are very few of my colleagues who don't believe in energy balance, a few, and we'll talk about that later. But I think most people don't really understand the implications of energy balance. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, is will an understanding and appreciation of energy balance help us better address obesity? So this system is certainly influenced by inherited factors. Look around the room. We all look different. A lot of that difference are due to genetics. Genetics plays a role. But behavior also plays a role. Eating, activity, sleep, and the environment plays a role. And I'm going to argue that obesity is an adaptation to our environment. Our physiology is working just fine in obesity. Nothing's broken. It's the environment that's broken. And so when we look at this system, a couple of things to point out. These factors are not independent. If you change any one thing, if you change energy intake, everything else changes. And where we make a mistake is we do our studies and we only look at one or two things. If we want to change energy expenditure or physical activity, everything else changes. Okay? So what can we learn from that? Let's start out with the question I hear all the time: which is more important in obesity, diet or physical activity? If you ask that question, you don't understand energy balance. The answer is yes. Both are important, okay? And I'm going to try to show you that. A couple of years ago, I was distressed to see this cover of Time magazine, The Myth of Exercise. Oh my gosh. Of course it's good for you, but it won't make you lose weight. It's what you eat that really counts. These people do not understand energy balance. So what I'm going to try to convince you is this is totally a wrong conclusion, okay? So their argument is, well, when you exercise, you just eat more. So it doesn't matter. You can go out and exercise. You're just going to eat more. It's going to have no effect on your weight. Maybe good for other things that Chip told you about. Is that true? Well, here's what we know about energy balance. This is a cartoon based on a lot of work from John Mayer in the 1950s. And I think this will help us understand that. So if you're up here, let's put it in perspective. Here's the increase in physical activity. Here's energy intake, and here's body weight. Okay, this is a cartoon, theoretical. So if you're over here, what happens? You're in the regulated zone. You're active. So your physical activity is very much tied to your intake. So as physical activity changes, you adjust food intake, and your weight stays exactly the same, just as Time magazine said happens. Okay? But most of America's down here. They aren't up here being active. Chip just told you how many people meet our guidelines. Now, if you're down here, the system works totally different. So as your activity goes down, rather than go down, food intake actually goes up. Okay? So the idea is there's some theoretical threshold, and the good news is this is not running marathons. As Chip said, going from here to here is increasing activity a little bit. When you're here, your biology is working with you to maintain weight. When you're down here, it isn't. Now, when we do, there are lots of studies where people increase physical activity down here. What happens to food intake? Goes down. Occasionally, somebody will go up. But in almost everybody in every study, When you add activity, food intake does not go up, it goes down, and people lose weight. So unless we can get people in this regulated zone, there's no way we're going to manage obesity with food intake alone. Very few, almost nobody, can achieve energy balance at a healthy weight being sedentary. Our bodies were meant to move, and when we stop moving, bad things happen. We've got to think differently around this. The normal state is being active. The abnormal state is being physically inactive, and we do a lot of our studies with inactive people. Okay, what happens when you start moving? Your muscles change, your insulin sensitivity changes, your metabolism changes in a way to set you up for weight gain. Your appetite is no longer tied to your energy expenditure. So when you're in the regulated zone, you eat to match your level of expenditure. When you're in the unregulated zone, it's no longer coupled. So your body's not working with you, it's working against you in maintaining weight. Here's another way to illustrate that. In this slide, I raised the concept of flux. Flux just means energy through the system. So as human beings, we achieve energy balance better at high flux than low flux. We achieve energy balance when we're eating a lot and expending a lot. That seems to be the natural state. And let me illustrate this. So here's sort of go back 4 or 5 generations when everybody lived on the farm. You had to be very active. So energy expenditure was high, not because we went to exercise, because we had to get through the day. So you ate a lot. The challenge was eating enough to meet this high level of physical activity. Okay, this is that regulated system. Things work really well here. So what happens over time? We become inactive. Now what we're trying to say is, let's tell the population to eat less. Let's take these people with low energy expenditure, and let's take all of our strategies toward people eating less. I think we've got decades of research showing that doesn't work. The reason is, as energy expenditure goes down, we get hungry. Our appetite is so strong. When I give this talk, people say, oh, you're giving a short shrift to food intake. Just the opposite. Our appetites are so strong that we can't eat less. This is an unsustainable situation. This is how we're trying to manage obesity today, telling people to eat less to match a low level of energy expenditure. Some people can do anything, but for most people, this is entirely impossible. So what happens in most cases is we eat a little more, we gain weight, and guess what? Gaining weight increases our energy expenditure, gets us back to that high flux level. So here's the simple message here. Your body works best when you have a lot of energy coming through. You expend a lot and you eat a lot. You can get there in 2 ways. You can exercise or you can become obese. Okay? So obesity now is an adaptation to the environment. So in an environment where there's food around and you don't have to be very active, if you're not moving, your body is going to gain weight as a mechanism to allow it to achieve energy balance. So if we want to reduce obesity, we're going to have to replace it with physical activity. Again, I'm not saying food isn't important, it's critically important, but we cannot, as a population, achieve energy balance at a healthy weight being sedentary. Now, a couple of other things related to that. John Ferret talked about small changes. I'm a real big believer in small changes. If you want to produce weight loss and get people back to ideal body weight, that takes big changes to do. You can achieve some weight loss with smaller changes, but it takes real big changes to keep weight off. And we're very good at this. I'll give anybody in this room money-back guarantee on weight loss, but I can't give you a money-back guarantee on weight maintenance. Most people who lose weight gain it back because they can't sustain the behaviors needed to keep this off. If you look at people who do succeed, what's the #1 predictor of success? Physical activity, okay? But here's where small changes can really play a role. The average American over the past few years has gained about 1 pound a year. Okay, you all have scales under your chair, so we're measuring you to see how you've done. That's equal to about an extra 15 calories a day. 15 calories per day, okay? So we're gaining weight because over time we're gradually eating a little more than we expend. If we could make small changes to stop weight gain so that every single person weighs the same next year as this year, we could do that with small behavior changes. over time, we gradually reduce obesity rates. So I'm a big believer in this because small changes, common sense, are much more feasible than big changes. So I think we have to understand energy balance to understand the factors that play a role in body weight. It's both food and physical activity, and they're inseparable. It would be like me saying, I want to estimate your net worth, but I only know you're only interested in your income. Okay? You can't separate the two. You can't separate intake from expenditure. Both are critical, but if we want to keep people as sedentary as they are right now, the only option is to become obese to achieve energy balance. Physical activity is more than burning calories, and that's where people make a mistake. They say, oh, I went out and ran a mile and I only burned a couple hundred calories and I can go buy the fast food and make that up real easy. It's way more than burning calories. It's getting your biology to work with you. It's getting your metabolism set up to burn fat rather than store fat. Prevention is ultimately going to be more feasible than treatment, and we have to put a lot of our efforts toward prevention, and small changes are what people can do. Now, I hear this all the time, eat less and exercise more. This is so wrong message. This is the wrong message. I will defy you to show me any population that's eating less and maintaining a normal body weight. We have to change this to move more and eat smarter. We increase physical activity. We look at things like energy density and portion size and fat and sugar. This is the way we're going to achieve energy balance. Food restriction doesn't work. Food is critical, but unless we increase exercise in the population, we have no hope of reducing high rates of obesity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, for a brilliant review of the topic. We are now to the point that we'll take questions from the group and have, I'm sure, a very stimulating discussion. We have a couple of people with roving mics, and so if you want to ask a question, you put up your hand. Please do not ask your question until you get the mic so everyone can hear. So anyone have a question? You're like my students. You just sit there. Oh, yes. Okay, Andrew.
Sure. This question's for the entire panel as well. What role do you think physical education can play, and do you think that we could benefit from a federal mandate for physical education?
I mean, there's no question that not only do we have an obesity epidemic, but the obesity epidemic is starting in our kids, and that was unheard of many decades ago. And now, you know, typically kids are not out on the streets playing all day. They're playing on computer games. They're watching videos. They're watching TV. Besides eating fast food, so their physical activity has markedly declined, and we're seeing obesity and even diabetes develop in kids, and that's going to lead to increased atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease risk. And so, certainly, I don't know that we can totally depend on schools to increase physical activity. We need that to be done, you know, throughout a kid's environment, and certainly the parents need to increase physical activity in themselves, and the kids follow suit, and that's probably the more important. But I think from the standpoint, school would be a way to assure that all kids are getting a modest amount of physical activity on all or most days. So I would be in favor of schools having physical education, and unfortunately many schools, as we know, have taken it out of their programs, and some don't have physical education at all in their programs. And so I hesitate sometime about mandates, but I think this may be important enough that in some way being part of an education curriculum that includes physical education, basically having PE either daily or at least several times a week would seem very, very reasonable.
Okay, let's hear what Dr. Hill has to say.
So I believe it's critical that kids are active during school. If kids came home from school being active an hour a day, we probably wouldn't be here talking about childhood obesity. put simply. Now, whether physical education is the way to go or not, I don't know. There was a lot of really poor physical education back when we had physical education. So I hesitate to say you have to do that. If I were king of the world, Steve actually is, but if I were king of the world, I would mandate that every kid every day has to be active an hour, whether that's taking a walk or whether it's physical education. I don't think it much matters. I would love it if we had good physical education. Key thing is to get kids to move. And what we found is the way you really get schools to get interested in that is show them the data about physical activity and academic performance. Schools are there to teach kids to learn. They're not against health, but their job is to teach kids to learn. We now know that kids that are eating well, kids that are physically active, and kids that are a healthy weight learn better. That's the way we get into schools. We got to get kids moving. PE is one way to do it, but there may be other ways.
Yeah, really exciting research in the last few years, not only with kids, but even with geezers. Exercise is good for the brain as well as the heart and muscles. And to take activity away from kids in schools so they'll get better scores on the math test is going in the wrong direction. Okay. Other questions? Yes?
I would, if I can, I always jump in too. I would add one thing. I think that what we need to do is we need to teach our kids to physical activities that are sustainable they can do for life. I mean, I think there's emphasis on team sports and individual competitive sports, which are a little bit disconnected from the real world, that you just don't do in the real world. So I think part of it is also, schools are there to educate. I think that Jim said that. I think we can educate people on lifestyle changes, the same small changes that were discussed in a couple of the presentations, that they can then do for life, be it something like tennis, be it something like walking or hiking, cross-country skiing, cycling, something to get at least them started on a path that they can continue with. The other thing I would add too is I would like to see home economics probably back in schools. So if I'm here to represent the diet side of the equation, I think part of the problem is kids don't know how to cook anymore. They don't know where food comes from. And I think part of this issue is if you could empower kids to make the right choices, instead of talking about everything they shouldn't be doing, which is like punishment, you punish your kids, you don't actually teach them what they need to do, the behavior they need to do. They just know what they're not supposed to do. We are creating a bit of an issue here because you're saying, don't eat sugar, don't eat fat, don't eat salt. Well, look at my environment. What can I eat then? And I think if we could teach kids to make their own food, go out, buy their own food, understand where it comes from, I think they can make better food choices.
I think it might be a good idea. I think it might be a good idea to teach them about energy balance.
Yeah.
I mean, that could be part of mathematics and biology, and teach them about behavioral
We're
science, how to
actually
manage
doing
behavior.
that, Steve, as our approach is to, we're doing this with fifth graders. And if you ever had a fifth grader, telling them what to do is counterproductive because they'll do just the opposite. But if you empower them with the skills, then you can't convince them that they're wrong. And so that's exactly the approach we're taking is let's teach them the skills. For example, most adults don't know how many calories you burn in walking a mile. Or if you get the the large French fries, how much activity do you have to do? So if you teach kids simple choices like that, then they're empowered to make their own decisions. So it's not telling them what to do, it's empowering them with the skills and then turning them loose and letting them do it.
Okay, was the question back here, ma'am?
Hi, Marcia Greenblum from the International Food Information Council. I think your statements are all terrific. I think we definitely have learned a lot from it. Can you give me a one-line summary what you'd like the Dietary Guidelines Committee to know? What messages would you like them to know about what you've just said?
Well, it's balance, variety, and moderation. It's that, it's the old dietitian mantra. So balance, variety, and moderation is still the way to go. So in all things, including our diet and physical activity.
I would like to see more food-based and dietary pattern-based approaches. So I mean, I think that this idea that we're just chasing macronutrients and we can actually take this reductionist approach to the diet and make it all about sugar or all about fat or all about salt, I think it's really wrong-headed, and I think the messaging around that is very difficult for people to actually interpret and do in their day-to-day life. So I think it's, I would like to see more, and I'm part of the Canadian Diabetes Association guidelines, and we introduced it this year, going food-based, dietary pattern-based, like diets that people eat. People eat foods, the foods they eat, not about the nutrients, about foods that can be part of a healthy dietary pattern.
To follow on that, I think we focus far too much on individual foods. This food has a health claim, this food has a health claim. Well, if that's all you eat, it's not going to be healthy. It's harder to do it for diet, but what people really need advice on is how to put the diet together, not what individual foods to eat and not eat.
Okay, other questions here from the group? Yes, sir, in the back. Give him the mic, please.
Hi, I'm Bob Lichter from George Mason University. The panel's just been talking about the role of the educational system. Jim Hill mentioned a problem of a Time magazine article being kind of media misinformation. What about the mass media as an educational system? How well or poorly is it doing, and how might it do a better job?
Yes, how well are they doing?
Steve, I'll start
yes,
on that.
please.
I mean, part of it is we work a lot with people in the media, and it's a tough profession now because we find that people don't often have the time to dive deep into these issues, and they do a superficial job. Saying that, I think it's a way to influence people, and it's a system we have to begin to work with. And we're talking with somebody earlier that, you know, you have a soundbite or you have 300 words to get a message across. That really is tough when you're transmitting science, but it's a system out there to reach people, and we experts have to figure out how to do a better job of helping those people in the media get the right message out.
Absolutely. There has to be good collaboration. I think one of the great problems in our society, whether this topic or anything else, is just the immense amount of material you can get on the internet. And has that been vetted at all for whether it's accurate or not? How do we deal with this so people get the accurate scientific information?
Great example, I'm going to put John here on the spot, as we were looking at a news report this morning. And John, I think it's a good time to bring that up and talk a little bit about what that said versus what you told us the real data are.
Yeah, I mean, there was that report from Fox News today. There was 10 points about what's the problem with diet, low-calorie sweeteners and all this, and none of it makes any sense at all. None of it. None of the points. And we could go through each of the 10 points and correct them, but I guess once it gets out there, it's out there. And what do you do about that?
I would encourage people in the media, when you have an issue like that you want to address, talk to people like this, who are scientists, who are fully familiar with the knowledge, not with the celebrity scientist who, they may have degrees, but are they really open-minded, thoughtful scientists? And I think that's something you could help with. Questions?
You might have touched on this just now, but I'm interested in your opinions on the misinformation about artificial sweeteners. I see these as real diet aids for people who might want to switch to a diet soda or something sweet that doesn't have the sugar. So I'm very concerned about the misinformation, frankly, junk science surrounding artificial sweeteners, which are perfectly safe and could really help people.
And John?
I agree 100% with what you said. I agree with you, and it's all, myths die hard. And that's what we're seeing. And, you can put anything on the internet, and all those things. And that's the problem today. And if you look at the science, that's where the issues are. Low-calorie sweeteners are safe, they're practical, they can be effective, they can help. They're small changes. So why not? But then you get, well, you know what you get.
Yeah.
So.
Jim?
But this is where the junk science really hurts us. For example, some of you know, I've been following a group of people in the National Weight Control Registry that have kept lots of weight off for a long period of time. And these people are hammered with the message, the only thing you should drink is water. And what they tell us is, I do it most of the time, but I get tired of that. I want some sweet taste. I want something. And they use non-caloric sweeteners. They never consume a caloric beverage, hardly ever. But they say that this is one of the things that has helped them keep the weight off. Because it's great advice to say just drink water, but in practicality, come on. You got to have a little fun with things. And the non-caloric sweeteners give us a way to have fun with no negative consequences.
Other questions? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll get you next. There's a man in the back, so we'll get him next. No, right now, first. No, I'm sorry. The moderator here needs to be a little more clear in the way he expresses things.
Thank you very much. I'm Colby Tyner with the American Heart Association. This discussion is about non-medical interventions for obesity, and we have seen recently the mass commercialization of mobile healthcare technologies. In particular, there are thousands of apps that have to do with dietary and obesity interventions, physical activity interventions, MyFitnessPal, for example. But the research is scant as far as the long-term effects they have on obesity rates. And I just want to get you all's input on what you all think the long-term effects will be on mobile health care technologies on obesity moving forward.
Well, we have a new center at my university, Technological Applications for Lifestyle Interventions. And we've just hired the endowed professor to lead that center, a colleague of several of these folks, Professor Delia Smith-West. And we need to do this research. Now, I think the research that we've been getting in the last very few years, this is a new area, but it is really quite encouraging. Well, it's not long-term, no. iPhone apps haven't been around all that long, but there are groups around the country and around the world who are investigating these approaches, and I think we need to do the research in the area, and let's see how successful we can be. And my simple-minded comment that I make often when this comes up, I think social media and using technology like iPhones and such, it seems to me in the Middle East in the last couple of years, it got people on the streets to do something more dangerous than walking. So why can't we get them on the streets to walk for that? So I'm sure others, John, yes.
Well, I think we know the package, you know, healthy eating, healthy exercise, healthy behavioral strategies. What's new are these delivery systems. It's how you deliver this information, and that's where these come in. We've done 4 of these. We did one with the Air Force and one in England and one, just finished one with the food, and they work. They, in my opinion, what we've seen so far is they produce about half the weight loss as coming in for, you know, the intensive, like we did with Look Ahead or any of these. But it's certainly the future. So I believe in the future. We need long-term, again, randomized trials, obviously. But I think they're very promising. And it is the future. I mean, there's no question that's where the field is moving toward.
If I can just add a comment to that, John, if you get half the effect from using these mobile apps as we would get with an intensive intervention, but you can reach 100,000 more people, it looks like the population is really great for the population.
So I think they're promising, but I still think weight loss is the easy part, and all these tools will help you eat less in the short run to lose weight. And eating less is the key, and it doesn't matter what you eat less of. To me, the proof is in the weight loss maintenance. Can the tools then begin to be a help over the longer period of time? They are tools. You know, as my colleague said, that's the icing. You still need a cake to put the icing on. The cake is the what to do, the behavioral strategies. These tools are delivery. So I'm hopeful, but I still think we haven't applied it to the real problem, which is how do you keep weight off?
Well, there are studies that have looked at the physical activity piece too. It's not just all been eating less, and those results are encouraging as well. So,
Jim, have you looked at those in the weight registry yet?
We haven't. We haven't. It's a good question to see
yeah.
to see if they use them. I don't know if they do or not. Great. You give me. I'll go home and do that study.
yes.
Right away.
Just something simple that's certainly effective is the use of pedometers. I mean, that's something that one, it's a way to measure, but it's also a way to provide positive feedback. And certainly corporate America is recognizing the potential value of this by getting their employees to wear the pedometer and then prove that they've done so many steps and then see reductions in their health premiums. And they see their medical costs going out of sight, so they really have the incentive, you know, to get a healthier workforce. They want you want to do that for altruistic reasons, but certainly just from a financial standpoint, it would be a tremendous help, and that has been something that's been very effective.
You know, I'm not a behaviorist, so Dr. Fourette can correct me, but one of the key principles, if you want to change any behavior, is kind of knowing where you are with that behavior, monitoring it, and whether it's counting your calories or counting your steps. And the pedometers and accelerometers allow us to do that really quite well. And I think we've done a fair bit of research that shows, yeah, that is useful. Yes, sir.
As a general question, we talk about increasing physical activity and how important it is. But in that balance, one is increasing expenditure, increasing aerobic capacity. What about lean muscle mass and increasing muscle integrity? How do you balance that out and weight training versus aerobic activity?
I mean, certainly most of what I talked about was aerobic fitness, and which is increased by general physical activity like the walking, the bicycle, the elliptical machine, swimming. But resistance exercise is also very important, and muscular strength does protect. I mean, Steve and I published a paper that got a fair amount of publicity about a year ago, reviewing all the literature on muscular strength being a very important predictor of cardiovascular risk factors and cardiovascular prognosis. And lean muscle mass always correlates with better prognosis. And from the glucose standpoint, increasing muscle mass is very helpful to improve glucose control. So aerobic exercise helps some, resistance exercise helps some, but when you put the two together, that's the group of diabetic patients who really are able to improve their glucose control. So,
well, to follow on that just a moment, you probably already figured that Chip and I are absolutely brilliant fellows, and we're brilliant at picking people to mentor, and so we've mentored Tim Church, who did a great randomized trial that was published a year or two ago in JAMA, where he took people with diabetes, assigned them to control, aerobic exercise, resistance exercise, or combo. And the combo group did the best in lowering glucose, hemoglobin A1C, et cetera. So yes, and resistance exercise is part of the US and the WHO, the guidelines, 2 days of resistance training a week, major muscle groups. So thanks for bringing that up, Carl. And Jim?
It's important, Steve, to illustrate too that it's probably the best thing you can do to oppose aging, because you lose lean body mass as you age. Some of that's inevitable, but those people that exercise lose less. And in terms of total mortality, your lean body mass is a pretty good predictor. So you don't want to lose what you have.
Absolutely. The lady here.
Hi, Kimberly Reed, International Food Information Council Foundation, and you mentioned WHO. Dr. Margaret Chan, WHO and the United Nations have set a goal for the world of reducing non-communicable disease, including heart disease and diabetes, preventable deaths 25% by 2025. And right now we're doing a lot of best practice sharing, and so I think your studies will help add to that. My question is, are there any countries outside of the United States that do some things that we might look to as well as a best practice for our own nation as we try to meet this goal?
Well, one of my favorites is Finland. I mean, they pushed early on improving physical activity in the population. And we go way back, you know, Finland had the highest heart disease rates in the world if we go back a few decades. And they really brought those down by massive community-wide interventions, both diet and physical activity. Australia has been doing a great job with public policy, particularly in the area of physical activity. I'm not quite as aware of what they're doing in the nutrition area. But yes, we need to be learning what some other countries are doing.
The other one I think we can learn from, not that they've reduced it, is France, because their rates are increasing a little bit, but not like the rest of Europe. And I think there are some interesting, the ways we approach food, psychological things that we may learn from the French. They don't have what a lot of us would consider a really healthy diet, but they're maintaining lower obesity rates. So there's something going on there that I think we could learn from.
Well, France was the home of the EPOD study, right? And there was real intensive community intervention, diet and physical activity. And I'm not intimately familiar with the results, but they've shown some great progress. John, did you want to comment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they have good outcome data, and it works. But, you know, when you have small communities, it's not that hard to do. It's harder to do in a country like the United States, but
harder
like
in
Houston, it would
yeah.
be impossible to do in Houston.
What about Las Vegas?
Vegas, absolutely.
Where he also lives.
Yeah.
Okay, who was next? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Shrita Bozeman from the Black Women's Health Imperative. I'm actually working on scaling up the National Diabetes Prevention Program and just returned from Los Angeles to see some of the great work we're doing with the city of LA. Just wanted to know, have you seen any more success or impact in terms of group interventions?
And
group interventions with any of your studies?
Well, yeah, John, you want to, or
Well, I
Jim?
mean, look ahead, you know, of course, we have 10 years of data now that we published, and it's based a lot on on the diabetes prevention program. So a lot of the intervention we took from the diabetes prevention program and then just updated it and so on. So 10 years of data shows very effective changes in body weight and maintenance of that weight. So sure.
And if we're talking about the group interventions, one of my colleagues, Professor Sarah Wilcox, has done several studies in African American churches in kind of rural South Carolina. Sarah James Aber and I have another study in African American churches where we're intervening on diet and physical activity, try to reduce inflammation on the colon cancer spectrum. So yeah, I'm a strong believer of getting groups involved.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
Social support, John, am I on target there with getting social support? If you're trying to change any behavior, if you can get social support from friends, workers, family, it's probably going to help you.
And that's where the group is so important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, up here? I'm really impressed. You're all really good. You don't start talking till you get that mic. Thank you.
Hi, Rebecca Golden from George Mason University and Statistical Assessment Service. I would like you to comment on the direction of academia with regard to these kinds of studies. You all began saying that there was a dearth of data, and then you presented actually quite a lot of data. We began with talking about well-respected scientists who are publishing in Nature with questionable results, and at the same time, we really value the peer review process. From my point of view, I see a new focus, which is on fMRI studies, and the focus, and I think misleading attempts to identify patterns of eating with addiction. And I wonder if you would comment as doctors as to whether there's some validity in this sort of approach or whether this is sort of a big red herring that's really distracting us. We're not seeing any of that on exercise. We're seeing it all focused on addiction, so to speak, of sugars and sugars mostly, but thank you.
I guess if I could start. I would just say, I mean, this has really been a pet peeve of mine because I really see it as putting the cart before the horse. I think we have to demonstrate that it's clinically meaningful effects. So when people start marching out these fMRI studies and looking at different regions of the brain that are associated with food intake regulation and addiction lighting up and somehow trying to draw inferences as it may relate to gaining weight and obesity, food intake regulation, so eating more, gaining weight, obesity, diabetes. I think they're really missing the big picture because I think we have data that shows that if you match for the calories, we don't see the weight gain. If you match for the calories, you don't see the adverse effects on other aspects of cardiometabolic health. Those are more clinically meaningful to me as a clinician. I don't treat fMRIs. I treat risk factors in patients, and I want to prevent clinically meaningful events from happening to them. I don't want them to get diabetes. I don't want them to get heart disease. I don't want them to die prematurely. So I think we have to really fall back on randomized trials. I think that's the highest level of evidence we have, and we have to look at clinically meaningful outcomes. And I think if we do find something, then you can go back and do the fMRI and have an academic seminar on why it works and try to explain the mechanism. But trying to put the mechanism ahead of actually showing any clinical effect, I think is really wrongheaded.
There are people working on exercise and some of these issues. I'm part of a large multi-center study funded by the National Institute of Alcohol and Drug Abuse, and it's a randomized trial in people assigned or made to go to drug abuse treatment centers. And typically they're assigned there for 4 or 5 weeks. They get randomly assigned to exercise or not, and those randomly assigned to exercise, they start exercising when they're in the center, and then after they are released from the center, we ask them to come back once a week to try to keep it going. We'll have some data on that in the next year, I think. It'll be interesting to see if it works, but there was enough evidence that this might well work through neural mechanisms to help people stay off the drugs that was causing them the problem. So fingers crossed. We'll see. Jim?
Rebecca, there's so many good points in the question you ask. Food addiction, I think, has taken us down a very, very dangerous path. And I would ask the underlying motivation for a lot of those people pushing the food addiction thing. I think we're addicted to food. Take it away and let's see what happens. But I don't think we get very far trying to blame the problem on being addicted to sugar or fat or this or that. I think you stretch the data to come up with that conclusion. The other thing I think you point out is if you look at the strategies that are out there in the public to address obesity, they all focus on aspects that we've pretty much told you today the science doesn't back up. Where are those strategies that involve both food and physical activity, looking at dietary patterns, looking at the data on substitution, not addition? Where are those kinds of strategies? And to me, that's what's missing. And I think it starts with an understanding of energy balance, but then it's, can we develop more effective strategies than the ones that are currently being put out there, strategies that are feasible, strategies that are consistent with societal values? I don't think we have any of those, and I think those are greatly needed.
Dr. Levy, did you want to make a comment?
I'm a practicing cardiologist, and something that I think that's been neglected in all of medicine, and particularly in cardiovascular diseases, is the important impact that psychological risk factors have on prognosis, and that's things like depression, anxiety, hostility. And we've actually published a lot of papers on the prevalence of psychological dysfunction in our cardiac patients. And basically, for example, depression in our patients with coronary heart disease, about 20% of the coronary heart disease patients meet criteria for depression. And following an exercise training program, we are typically seeing 50% reductions in the prevalence of depression, anxiety, and hostility. And more importantly, these adverse psychological characteristics are associated with higher mortality. And we've correlated the reductions in mortality with exercise training have correlated with reductions in psychological stress. And then to carry it one step further, we showed that we showed that those who improved their cardiorespiratory fitness had very marked reductions in depression and depression-related mortality. Yeah. Those who didn't improve their fitness didn't have either. And one added importance, that we showed that the benefits occurred with just small improvements in fitness. The group who got a small improvement in fitness got the same amount of benefit as those who got the large improvement in fitness. And again, this is in coronary patients, but if this is applicable to outside of coronary disease, it can have a profound impact, and it would suggest not only can patients improve their prognosis, but they can improve their psychological stress and psychological stress-related mortality with just a small improvement in overall fitness.
John?
Just fMRIs have been dubbed by some as phrenology of the brain, you know, and it's just a cart before the horse. I agree with John. We just need so much more information. From a clinical point of view, you know, it's not very practical. So we still, what Jim said is, we know the way to treat, or at least we know what's going on. And so it's just too soon to say anything about fMRIs as any practical significance.
To just pick up a moment on the depression, one of my colleagues did a great randomized placebo-controlled trial in patients with depression, and the ones that walked 180 minutes a week at 50% of capacity had reduction in depression symptoms that are equivalent to what the meta-analyses show for drugs and cognitive behavioral therapy. That's not to say it's better, but it's equivalent. So then with Dr. Trivedi, we did another study where we got patients that and he's one of the top psychiatrists in the country dealing with these issues, where he had failed to get remission of their depression with standard medical approaches. We then randomly assigned them to exercise, and they didn't all get better, but there was significant improvements, and many of them got better. So exercise, it's good for the brain. And just one other quick thing, quality of life. There have been a lot of good randomized trials in patients who have cancer and then randomly assigned to exercise or not. Quality of life improves. So whether it prevents the cancer, which we do have some we do have some evidence on that, but you're feeling better while you're living. Is that a good idea? Yes. Okay, who was next? We are getting close to the end, but we can take, yes, go.
Back to the, Bob Karsh, American University, back to the question of youth, particularly in the youth, and physical activity. We seem to have at least in the US and I think in other countries as well, sort of this bimodal distribution. We have bigger, stronger, faster, more highly skilled youth than maybe we've ever had. And on the other side, we have a pocket of young individuals that are already predestined for clinical conditions, early diagnosis of. How do we balance that out? You know, we're in a society that has the best and the worst at the same time. You made some comments earlier about physical education in the schools. What are your recommendations specifically about that?
The latter group are really good video game players. No, I think you're right. I think if you look at where the resources go in most schools, they go for the sports teams, the elite athletes, and we don't have much for the others. So we have to find a way to spread it out, because I think there's a sense of we don't value kids just being active, we value the ones that perform well. So I think what you're talking about is a need for systemic change in how we allocate resources to activity. And back to the schools, I think our way in is through academic achievement. I think that's what schools care about, and that's the argument we have to use to make some of these changes.
One last question, anyone? Well, we do certainly thank you all for coming this morning. I hope this brilliant group of panelists has provided you with information that you'll find useful, and I'm sure if a thought occurs to you as you're driving home, they can be assessed by email. So thanks again for coming.